In this lesson, we're going to discuss the title and authorship of the book of Acts. I want to begin with a couple of quotations that capture the spirit of the book of Acts. J.B. Phillips says, in the book of Acts, the reader is stirred because he is seeing Christianity, the real thing, in action for the first time in human history. Here we are seeing the church in its first youth, valiant and unspoiled. A body of ordinary men and women joined in an unconquerable fellowship never before seen on this earth. The reader is disturbed, for surely this is the church as it was meant to be. It is vigorous and flexible, for these are the days before it ever became fat and short of breath through prosperity, or muscle-bound by over-organization. So the study of the book of Acts through the centuries has motivated many Christians to seek to reform the church, to restore it back to its original purity and simplicity. E.J. Goodspeed says about the book of Acts, where else would you find in so few pages such a varied series of exciting events, trials, riots, persecutions, escapes, martyrdom, voyages, shipwrecks, rescues, set in that amazing panorama of the ancient world, Jerusalem, Antioch, Philippi, Corinth, Athens, Rome, and with such scenery and settings, temples, courts, prisons, deserts, ships, seas, barracks, theaters. Has any opera such variety? A bewildering range of scenes and actions passes before the eye of the historian, and in them all he sees the providential hand that has made and guided this great movement for the salvation of mankind. So Goodspeed reminds us that the book of Acts is a good read. It's an interesting read. It's suspenseful. It travels all over exotic places around the ancient world. So it's a fun book to read as well as a spiritually enriching book to read. Let's begin by talking about how the book of Acts got its name. The title used in the Greek manuscripts for the book of Acts is Praxes Apostolon, the Acts of the Apostles. However, we don't think that the author actually gave that title to the book. Probably it was a title given to the book by later readers, but we do find it in the earliest manuscripts of the book of Acts. Well, the word praxes was a technical term for narratives of heroic deeds of famous historical or mythological figures. Some have compared it to the term historical monograph that we might use today. A historical monograph is a book of history that focuses on a specific time period and a specific set of events. For example, I've just finished reading a book called The Six Armies of Tennessee, which is a book about the Chickamauga and Chattanooga campaigns in the Civil War. It's a book about a selected, narrow period of history and a certain set of events, and that is true of the character of the book of Acts. So the title Praxes makes sense for the book, but why is it called Acts of the Apostles? This seems like a misnomer because the book rarely mentions all the apostles. In fact, the book focuses primarily on two main characters, Peter and Paul. The first half of the book focuses on the activities of Peter, and the second half on the activities of Paul. This is why I have chosen El Greco's painting of Peter and Paul as the theme picture for these PowerPoints. And so for the first half of Acts, we will use Peter's picture in our PowerPoints, and in the second half of Acts, we'll use Paul's picture. But even to refer to Paul as an apostle is problematic, because the author seems reluctant to do so. He refers to Paul as an apostle only twice, both times in chapter 14, where he also refers to Barnabas as an apostle. So this book doesn't really focus on the acts of all the apostles, so it's not a totally appropriate title, but it does focus on that apostolic period, that time during which the apostles provided the eyewitness testimony that built a bridge between the life of Jesus and the later church. Some people, like Erhard, have suggested perhaps a better title is Acts of the Holy Spirit. The Holy Spirit is really the main character who works through the missionaries and evangelists in the early church to carry out the mission of the church. But that wasn't the title the early Christians gave to the book, so we call it the Acts of the Apostles, or simply the Book of Acts. Now let's talk about the authorship of the Book of Acts. Who wrote this book? If we look just at the book itself, we see 5 characteristics of the author. First, he is anonymous. He doesn't give us his name. He doesn't begin this book like Paul begins his letters by stating his name. So just reading the book itself doesn't provide any help to identifying the name of the author. Secondly, it's apparent that the author of the book of Acts also wrote the third gospel, which traditionally has been called the Gospel according to Luke. The first verse of Acts refers back to the third gospel to tie those 2 books together. So it appears that Luke and Acts consists of a 2-volume work authored by the same person. Thirdly, the author appears to have been a companion of Paul. Several times in the book of Acts he uses the plural pronoun we to indicate that he was present with Paul during certain events in Paul's ministry. So he was at least an occasional companion or associate of Paul. Fourthly, most scholars think that the author was a Gentile. Now, there is some debate about that. There are some scholars like Jacob Urvel who have argued that the author was a Jew, but most scholars think he was a Gentile. And lastly, he was well educated. The vocabulary of the Gospel of Luke and the book of Acts is extensive. The author uses sophisticated literary techniques such as litites, uses complicated grammatical constructions. So it appears that the author was someone who had been educated, who was knowledgeable, who was well read. So then, can we give a name to the author? Well, one of the earliest manuscripts of the third gospel, P75, assigns the name Luke to that gospel, according to Luke. And in the 2nd century, we find 3 writings that attach that name Luke to the book of Acts: the Muratorian Canon, Irenaeus, and Clement of Alexandria. So that's very early tradition that assigns Luke as the author of the book of Acts. Later church fathers such as Origen, Eusebius, and Jerome agree that Luke was the author of the third gospel and the book of Acts. So who is Luke? Well, Luke is mentioned 3 times in the New Testament, all 3 times in Paul's letters. In Philemon 24, Paul refers to Luke as his fellow worker. In Colossians 4:14, he refers to Luke as the beloved physician, which raises the question whether he had been trained in the medical arts. And in Paul's last writing, 2 Timothy 4:11, he describes Paul as his sole companion. So it appears that Luke was with Paul at the very end of his life. So that doesn't give us a lot of detail about the background, the life, the identity of the author, but it does support what we see in Acts, that the author was a companion and associate of Paul. The last question we want to consider is, was Luke actually a doctor? Was he trained as a physician, as Colossians 4:14 might suggest? In 1882, W.K. Hobart published The Medical Language of St. Luke, in which he argued that the writer of the Gospel of Luke and the book of Acts was well acquainted with the language of the Greek medical schools. He argued that the terminology used by the author was of such a technical nature that only a trained doctor would have been familiar with that terminology. Several decades later, H.J. Cadbury re-examined Hobart's arguments, and Cadbury showed that the terms used by the author of the Gospel of Luke and the book of Acts would have been known to any knowledgeable person of the day. These were common medical terms, and they don't provide any conclusive, definitive evidence that the author had been trained as a physician. In a similar way, today many of us know names of diseases, names of surgical procedures, medications, even though we're not trained as physicians. But just being an informed, knowledgeable person would cause someone to be familiar with this kind of terminology that is used in the Gospel of Luke and the book of Acts. Some have pointed out that the author also uses technical legal terms. Yet, does that indicate that he was trained as an attorney? He uses technical nautical terms, but that doesn't necessarily mean that he worked as in the profession of a sailor. So the evidence is inconclusive just based on the content of the Gospel of Luke and the book of Acts. All we have is that one reference in Colossians 4:14, which is a tantalizing reference, but that's all we have to go on. In the next lesson, we'll discuss the date and purpose of the book of Acts.